Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the La Jolla Historical Society. My name is Helen. I'm the Executive Director here. Very pleased to welcome you to what promises to be a fascinating conversation between some wonderful scholars, celebrated on the occasion of our current exhibition, Helen and Newton Harrison, California Work, which we are presenting in conjunction with Getty's PST Art and Science Collide program. So very, very proud to be able to share this work with you and to welcome all of these wonderful speakers. I'm going to open our conversation today with our La Jolla Historical Society land acknowledgement. Nat Kualikuli, La Jolla, the land on which the La Jolla Historical Society stands, is part of the unceded ancient homeland and traditional territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. We honor the Kumeyaay creation story and its important connection to the water's edge from which the Kumeyaay emerged. We recognize the continuity of earth, energy, and elements that remain present here since time immemorial. We gratefully acknowledge the heritage of this land, of the sovereign bands of the Kumeyaay, their ancestors of the past, their people of the present, and their descendants of the future. We will honor and uplift the history, language, and culture of the Kumeyaay and act as a platform to elevate Native voices. And I just want to take a moment to share that the La Jolla Historical Society is committed to continuing to deepen our relationships with the Kumeyaay community. And this summer, I hope you'll come back and visit us often, but especially when we open a new exhibition in June that celebrates the Kumeyaay Visual Storytelling Project. The outcome of this project is this incredible graphic novel. It's actually a two-part graphic novel. It can be read both ways. And we'll have an immersive exhibition that invites you into this very important, underdocumented history in June. So come back and see us then. Jolla has worked on this project for more than 5 years and produced an incredible publication that accompanies the exhibition as well. We have those available for purchase here and in the gallery. She's also a professor in the School of the Arts at Cal State San Marcos University. So with that, I'll pass it to Tatiana. Thank you.
Okay, so while it's warming up, I can start. I have a little bit of presentation formal, so I'm going to read a little bit, not to confuse myself with too many thoughts. But first of all, I would like to thank all of the people here in the panel, and of course Anne, Douglas, and Chris Mantle for agreeing to work with us. We've been working on this panel for quite a long time, actually thinking about what would be the structure, what would be the questions. So it's been a 1 year in the making, this conversation, what we're going to have today. And then we have this really distinguished panel that Chris and Anne will introduce, but I just would like to thank you all agreeing to be here. Thank you so much. So let's walk a little bit in history. Who were Helen and Newton Harrison and why we are doing that? So as part of British Pacific Standard Time, Art and Science, La Jolla Historical Society in San Diego, in collaboration with 3 other exhibition venues, is presenting Helen and Newton Harrison California Work. That is a groundbreaking exhibition because it offers a critical reappraisal of their California-based works. And we aim to highlight Harrison's art and science collaboration that actually ignited and inspired the field of ecological and environmental art. What is ecological art? Well, ecological art is a distinctive subcategory of environmental art that focuses on the biological interdependencies in ecosystems. And to understand ecosystems, to work them as an artistic medium, and to create successful ecological environmental interventions, the Harrison have had to master environmental science. So we're talking about this kind of new dimension that they created as a result of their work. Next, please. Okay, and next. And here we have a couple of slides of them. They were absolutely very amazing people and very lovable people. And some of you in the panel, stop here. Some of you in the panel, of course, had the privilege to work with them for quite a long time. So at first, Newton was a sculptor and painter, and Helen was a researcher and educator. So Newton graduated from Yale with master's and bachelor's at the same time, 1965, and secured his first faculty position at the University of New Mexico. And then he was basically stolen from New Mexico to come to San Diego to become the founding faculty of the Visual Arts Department. And Helen, of course, came with him. She was a quite amazing advocate for education, activist in feminism, and a scholar, really articulate scholar in literature, and she had also a position teaching literature at the University of New Mexico. So they came here, they helped to found the Department of Visual Arts. In 1969, they began to work with ideas of urban farming and soil reclamation. And Newton became involved with the making of earth as a kind of private performance that is documented here. And so by gathering sand and clay, sewage, sludge, cow, chicken, and horse manure, and churning it repeatedly for 4 months, and using a hand shovel instead of a steam shovel, to actually create this metaphor for caring for earth rather than destroying earth. And that becomes one of the first important metaphors that they use. And Helen also didn't, was aside, next slide. She decided to collaborate with Newton, and she began growing strawberries in the soil that Newton made, and that was presented as a separate exhibition, so-called Making Strawberry Jam, in an exhibition called In a Bottle that took place in California State University, Fullerton. And making earth and then strawberry jam became a metaphor for regenerating of the earth worldwide, because it was a response to the soil being endangered in many of the places throughout the world, and it is far worse today than when it began. Influenced by John Cage aesthetics, chance operations, Harrison's continued to make grow species, constructing hog pastures, fish farms, portable orchards, flood pastures in such places as the Hayward Gallery in London, the New National Gallery in Berlin, the Houston Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, and so forth. And there were a series of these exhibitions that not only metaphorically, but also concretely, they referenced earth and nature, practically and symbolically. They created actual ecosystems encompassing the biological processes that generate and regenerate in order to create themselves. Following the successes and controversies of the survival pieces that actually we have in the gallery, all documented through those original design drawings, and with some of the recreations of the portable orchard, that we gave permission from the Harrison family to do that, and making earth performance as well. And we're going to have strawberry performance on December 8th. Don't miss it. You can taste the strawberries. So all of these pieces essentially expanded their critique of environmental degradation, pursued more ardently their quest for the means of survival, and throughout the 1970s, 1980s, the scope of their work expanded constantly because they shifted from close, portable, or localized ecosystems to bioregional works, taking a greater interest in ecological restoration on an even larger scale. Next slide. So their work also generally relied on scientific methods in researching ecologies by staging real-life experiments and discovering conditions necessary to sustain functioning of ecosystems. Additionally, they interrogated and critiqued techno-scientific models of the ecosystems of industrial and capitalistic modes of production and extraction, and came to realize the political force of their work. So, they developed 1980s and 1990s a series of very innovative projects that in fact inspire artists today, and especially I would like to make mention of the Metabolic Studio in Los Angeles that actually closely aligns with some of the strategies that Harrison's began to use in 1980s, 1990s. And so they, what we see here, a combination, installation-based presentation in galleries, museums, and public spaces, which were conducted in parallel with field-based work and research that sought to inform and influence governmental policies and planning processes globally. Aroe's eco-release, which we see here on the historic photograph when it was first presented, a serpentine for Pasadena, Devil's Gate, a refuge for Pasadena, and California Wash, Santa Monica Promenade, all works that were conceived and accomplished in 1985 to 1997. Next slide. They raised awareness of the ongoing negative impacts of industrialization and environmental disregard on the land, proposing ecological restoration and reinvention of specific watersheds and finite environmental systems in Los Angeles. The Harrison's methods involved organization of factual materials such as archival maps, photographs, of environmental despoliation into cohesive narrative. And they combine those photographic maps and their proposed interventions with the proposals that were written in poetic form. And you can see in the galleries we have those separate poems for Aroe Seco release, for Devil's Gate Park in Pasadena, and for Santa Monica Promenade. So in the later part of their career, they embarked what they call the force majeure series of work. They believe that they must invest concerted effort in design of future ecologies that would be able to function in new temperature regimes and environmental conditions. And so this last 2 decades of their practice, known as a force majeure, introduced a new form of cross-disciplinary activity that would anticipate major planetary events and demand responding adaptation. In collaboration with scientists, the artists assumed a new kind of agency as re-terraformers, planetary gardeners, responsible for the mitigation of species, creation of succession ecosystems, and reorganization of human settlements. And now, in conclusion, and we can have next slide. So the Harrisons believe that unless artists, scientists, industry, and government create working environmental projects together, habitable environments that can sustain future generations of life may not exist. Fortunately, their book that was published in 2016, after 45 years, Counterforces on the Horizon, essentially put that very positive message that was shared with the public. And so the exhibition here that we hope you will take a message is that Harrison's diverse artistic practice provides for us opportunities how we can think about wide-ranging art and project in art and science, how artists and scientists can collaborate. It also gestures to the mediated relationship that this work can create by engaging community activists, community in dialogue, politicians, and of course scientists and artists in order to essentially broaden our education and understanding what it means to be ecological artist or ecological citizen today. Thank you so much.
My name is Anne Douglas. I'm a Professor Emerita from Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen in Scotland. And my colleague Chris Fremantle and I are here at the kind invitation of Tatiana and Heath Fox to coordinate the panel discussions for the 4 exhibitions that make up Helen and Newton Harrison California works. and we're very excited to be here. It's been an absolute joy it's been a great honour and also a great joy to be part of this whole process. My area of expertise is actually artistic research, which is really trying to understand the ways that artists form practices in the circumstances in which they find themselves. And so it has a long legacy with people like Paul Klee and even Leonardo da Vinci, all of whom reflected on their work and reflected critically in ways that would help them develop the work creatively. We met Helen and Newton in 2005 and have worked with them on 2 projects in the UK. Chris on Greenhouse Britain in 2009, and I worked with them in 2017-18 on a project called The Deep Wealth of This Nation, Scotland. And we've also written on their work over that time, and most recently come up with a book that was published last month. And this enthusiasm, this incredible enthusiasm, they're obviously incredibly engaged and enthusiastic about the Harrisons' work, and believe actually that they are one of the most important artist practices that young people and their audiences can now learn from, not just in relation to the environment, but as consummate artists. So I'm just going to hand on to Chris now. He's going to introduce the panel.
We have a fabulous panel today, which kind of runs through from Gabe Harrison, Helen and Newton's son, who helped establish the Harrison studio and worked in the Harrison studio. I worked with Gabe on Greenhouse Britain. We have fond memories of train journeys across the UK. We then have Chris Scorza, who is the curator of education from the Whitney, where they have just installed Portable Orchard, one of the key survival pieces. We then have Teddy Cruz and Fona Foreman, who are, along with Lauren Bond, people who are very directly working in dialogue with the Harrisons' ideas. So that's the running order. I'm going to hand over to Gabe, and I'm going to hand him this lovely microphone, and we're going to make it work.
You know what? If you guys can hear me, I'm gonna... And in that spirit, I'm going to change direction a little bit and just spend a minute or two to create a sense impression of the kinds of works that they do at big scale. Because our goal here, as Lauren so eloquently put it, and Teddy too in the conversation earlier, is to engage you all. So I'm going to back away a little bit from the academic and talk a little bit about the ethos and spirit of what they were doing. So my name is Gabriel Harrison. Start on the first slide, please. And I was a founding member of the Harrison Studio in the 1990s, along with my parents, and then Vera Vestergaard. Vera and I were both newly minted architectural designers in the 90s, and so we were really excited to join and start on this big journey with them. So I'm going to just briefly show 2 projects, each of which could take an hour to unfold, and I'm not going to do that, thank you very much, but rather, just for the sake of this conversation, give you a glimpse into the way that they thought about working with the environment at large scale, literally a sense impression. Because as they would often say, you have to attack the problem at the scale at which the problem exists. So the first thing, before we get anywhere, one of the most common questions that comes up over and over again, and it stops the conversation sometimes, is that why is this art? You're confronted with maps and drawings and texts, and over and over again, how is this art? Why isn't this science? Why isn't this something else? And the answer is that it's really because Helen and Newton were always looking for pattern in the landscape, pattern in human behaviors, and they look to weave them together into a common story in much the same way a filmmaker would do, a novelist, or a poet. And that's the level at which you should take them as you look at their work. Can you hear me back there?
No.
No.
Oh, you can't? Okay, I'll talk about it. Thank you. So, In 1994, we were invited by the Cultural Council of South Holland to look at the massive plan to urbanize the center of Holland, okay? And what had been called the green heart of Holland, as you can see on the right in that map there, is this great green center open space in Holland. And their plan, which they were very proud of at the time, was to create urbanization across it. They had to make room for another 1 million people, 600,000 houses. So they proposed on the left, which we reversed the map of Holland and called it bad government. Good government on the right side, play on the Lorenzetti brothers from the 15th century. But anyway, and you could see that they were going to carpet bomb the center. And so we just said, look, this doesn't make any sense. You know, and so what they began to do is they began to recognize immediately that they needed to reframe the conversation, and that human activity in the form of towns and cities need boundaries to thrive, but biodiversity and ecosystems need continuity and connection to thrive. So they set about telling a new story. Go ahead. So the first thing they did is say, hey, what are we going to do? How are we going to redirect the development? And they went in, we started doing a series of maps, and we worked with planners, with people in the local environment, mayors and other people to take a look and say, how could we place those 600,000 people in the existing urban infrastructure and leave the green heart alone? Go ahead to the next. And so this great biodiversity ring was formed. And the idea was to refocus all of the development energy away from the center into the existing developed areas and create a new, what they call eco-urban edge, which is that relationship between the natural environment and a thriving biodiverse ecosystem and human dwelling. That is not living in the ecology, but living at the edge of it and gaining the benefits of both. Okay, so the next slide. Flash forward another 15 years, this is the project Chris was talking about. And we were invited to Britain to take a look and talk about what the effects of the rising sea level was going to do as climate change impacted the island of Britain. It was essentially redrawing the map, forcing people into migration. And the idea was that in 50 years, millions of people would have to migrate up into the highlands. They could defend proportions of it, like parts of England, parts of London. But what are you going to do with the millions of villages along the edges that had nothing to do? There was no way, it was too expensive to defend. So for urban life, they were looking at the idea of how could we create a series of towers, this was in the Lee Valley, and create a kind of interesting village life, floor by floor, you know, with gardens and other things, and create a carbon neutral experience, but in a vast field of biodiversity, so that the advantage was to both. You would have human settlement concentrated and biodiversity spread throughout. Go to the next place. Okay, so then the question came up, what about the villages? What about people in smaller towns and environments? And we started to look, oh, that's a little washed out. But you can see we're looking at what would carbon neutral life look like with green roofs, with waters flowing underneath, because we realized that people were going to have to move up to the high ground. And what could we do about that? But in village life, we wanted to keep and maintain this cultural identity that people had. So move to the next one, please. Okay, and so you can see that we started to look at the highlands, and we had a 2-week charrette with graduate students at the University of Sheffield. And we started to identify areas that could possibly hold village life in that way. So the first thing we did is say, how big is here? And we identified just a little bit of the watershed area, because the question of how big is here always begins with the idea of a watershed and the boundaries based on the ecological systems, not the cultural and visual systems. I'll get into that. Okay. Then we moved to the idea that they began to look for pattern, and you can see as they began to see where is nature, how can we create this biodiverse continuity and connectivity at the same time that we're looking at creating village life. Okay. So basically then, just to sort of sum it up, they were always looking at this larger scale, and they realized that it's a story of seeing and creating pattern and telling stories about them in word and image in order to move a cultural conversation forward. And we're hoping that we're going to gain that with the three of you. Go ahead.
Again, I'm Chris Gorsa. I'm the head of it.
Yeah.
I'm the head of education at the Whitney Museum of American Art. For those that don't know me, I am a brown Latina with short hair wearing a burgundy shirt and a black skirt and a black sweater. And I go ahead and describe myself for those that are low vision or blind so that all of you can understand who I am. And I'm going to try to do the same thing for my slides. So here we have a slide that reads the Whitney Museum of American Art. And it says survival piece number 5, portable orchards creating social awareness. And I'm here in a very interesting capacity. As I said, I oversee the education department at the Whitney Museum. So I come to this conversation thinking a lot about how the Harrisons were not just artists, but educators. And how, as Gabe was saying, it was very important for them to kind of collate those stories and those narratives. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of what we've done at the Whitney, and I'll play a video that I think speaks for better than I can on some of the things that we're doing. A little washed out here, but this is the original drawing of portable orchard, which depicts 18 planters and a series of instructions, which include a recipe for a feast. The idea of collecting the harvest of the orchard. These are 18 different citrus trees. And this is how it looks at the Whitney. So it's inside on our 8th floor gallery. For those that haven't been at the museum is now located in the Meatpacking District on Gansford Street. And our 8th floor gallery is our temporary exhibition gallery. And it has a beautiful skylight and a view to the Hudson and conversation with the east side of the city. So as you get off the elevator, you see this wonderful orchard that welcomes you and really gets you out a little bit of that urban landscape. Here is a little vignette of kind of a rendition that portrays a video of the Harrisons as the installation was presented at Cal State Fullerton. And then a series of documents in the vitrine to the left. The tiniest little image there is copy of The Silent Spring, which is the book that inspired the Harrisons to really start thinking about this process and thinking about what were we going to do to sort of course correct the impact on our environment. And one of the things that we have done as educators is think about how do we bring people into the museum and think differently about their own environment and their relationship to the city, their relationship to the trees that they have around. So we've done a series of programs. We had a day for older adults, and it started here with meditation and really guided meditation. We gave people headphones or they had their own devices, and it was about a walking meditation through the orchard and guiding you into looking. We also have done Ask a Horticulturist. It's been one of the most popular programs at the museum. We used to have Ask the Curators, and those get a crowd just like here. Ask a Horticulturist gets twice the amount of people. And it's because people come to not only ask us about the art, but really thinking about how do I plant a tree in my house? What is it? How do I take care of my plants? How do we compost better? Really thinking more broadly about what it means. They asked us a lot about how would we sustain this artwork in the galleries, how long would it live, would it all survive? And I think one of the beauties is that we have been seeing a change and shifting. Not all of the trees have been able to survive. We have 2 or 3 that have died, but that's what happened in nature. And for us to be able to observe those things is incredible. We have done programs called Urban Harvest Drawing, and we do still life drawings from the harvest of the trees. So if we have an orange that has fallen, grapefruit, and a few of the leaves, we bring them into the gallery space and the adjacent classroom or in the area to start thinking about what does it mean to think like an artist. And now I'm going to play this video that I think does an incredible work. One of the things, we're doing the little arrow there. My department does everything from the label writing for an exhibition to the adult programming to the kids programming to your audio tour for programs for people with disabilities, community engagement in and out of the museum. And this video was produced in partnership with the Director of Family Programs and the curator and the Director of Interpretation. So it's a beautiful collaboration of where you think maybe the person who leads the youngest ones is not maybe the right person to lead the adults, but you'll be surprised.
Now, the next presentation sort of shifts from the Harrison's work to current work going on, and Teddy and Fona will present together what they're working on.
Thank you so much for inviting us while the slides come up. We're going to do a combined 10-minute, 5 and 5-minute presentation. Fona Forman, who is to my left, is a professor in political theory at UCSD and is the founding director of the Center on Global Justice. And she leads a variety of climate change agendas for the University of California and for the state. And I'm Teddy Cruz, co-director of the Center on Global Justice, focusing on cross-border urbanization. I'm also a professor in the Visual Arts Department, professor in public culture and spatial practice. And I should say my job I owe to the Harrisons, because really they set up a legacy, a precedent that somebody like me, an architect, a practitioner, engaged in this very specific geography of conflict could be part of that community. There's no school of architecture, in other words, at UCSD, so I find myself in exile. So, let's see here. So there's much to say about the Harrisons' legacy and how their thinking inspires our work. But we will take just a few minutes to share a few impressions that resonate, their influence in our research-based practice at the UCSD Center on Global Justice. A few critical issues we can open up later through conversation, we hope. There is deepening contention across the world between the migration community and the conservation community, between those who advocate for the migrants' rights to safe movement and resettlement, and those who prioritize protection against biodiversity loss, ecosystems, and wildlife habitats. We created this infographic recently for the IUCN to illustrate global hot zones where this clash is intensified by climate change. Our border region is in fact one of these hotspots, an epicenter of both accelerating migration and dramatic biodiversity loss. So finding common ground, very literally, common ground for nature and people is our priority at the Center on Global Justice. We have taken a deeply rooted approach to urban ecological design intervention, advocating for a longer view of resistance and strategic thinking about cultural and spatial transformation in the San Diego-Tijuana border region. To carry out this work, we have designed a platform that connects our design office at UCSD with conditions in the field, and have built a network of spaces on both sides of the wall called the UCSD Community Stations, where we co-develop spaces of dignity and sanctuary for nature and people at the city's periphery in close partnership with border communities. As a distributed system of public spaces that transgress the wall, the community stations specialize social justice. For us, justice in the border zone is a distributive concept. We believe that to tackle regional disparities, we must both redistribute resources and also redistribute knowledges. Think of the stations as a distributed university where universities and communities meet to share knowledges and resources and to collaborate on research, dialogue, cultural and educational activities, advocacy, migrant housing, public space, and climate adaptation infrastructure. We also designed the community stations as a unique model of co-development between university and community, where the economic power of UCSD becomes leverage for our partners to develop their own housing, public space, and green infrastructure. Each community station is designed, funded, built, and programmed collaboratively between our campus and the community. We have developed 4 stations, 2 in San Diego and 2 in Tijuana, one of which has now become the largest refugee shelter in the US-Mexico region. There is no time here to elaborate on these projects, but we would love to share the critical context that has given shape to our stations in Tijuana. They are both located in the Laureles Canyon, an informal settlement adjacent to the border wall and home to 100,000 people. So let me set the scene here. Tens of thousands of migrants have found refuge in the informal settlements in the edges of Tijuana. This site, it is an important juncture of conflict. Here, the topography of Tijuana's canyons clash with the border wall before spilling northbound into an environmentally protected estuary in San Diego, now layered with security infrastructure. At this hotspot, the conflict between natural and jurisdictional systems and between ecological and political priorities is profound. This aerial video shows Laureles Canyon and the precarious condition of the informal settlement that has sprawled on the slopes. This site sits 30 minutes away from our campus and demonstrates the dramatic proximity of wealth and extreme poverty in our region. Laureles Canyon is impacted by dump sites, drastic erosion, flooding and landslides, and all of this is exacerbated by the dramatic precipitation fluctuations of climate change. And because Laureles Canyon lacks water and waste management infrastructure to mitigate these impacts, much of the trash, along with tons of sediment, flows northward, downstream, ending in the estuary in San Diego, contaminating these bioregional assets. So in other words, here, the border wall is truly an artifact of environmental insecurity for both sides. These impacts have intensified in recent years because of a profound lack of collaboration, as I said, between San Diego and Tijuana to manage these cross-border flows. In the last decades, 70% of open lands in Laureles Canyon have been lost to irregular urban growth. We have identified and bundled unsquatted parcels in the settlement that are still environmentally rescuable to shape an archipelago of conservation. We are advancing an ambitious regional conservation project called the Cross-Border Commons that links the estuary in the US with the informal settlement in Mexico, forming a continuous social and ecological envelope that transgresses the wall and protects the environmental systems on both sides. We have curated a coalition of state and municipal agencies, nonprofits, and universities on both sides of the wall to adopt and protect the remaining unsquatted public lands inside the settlement.
But we really want to underscore the cultural strategies through which we are reimagining eco-social futures and rethinking jurisdiction in this militarized zone. At the community stations, we curate what we call unwalling experiments that dissolve the wall using visual tools, maps, and performative strategies to reframe the cultural conversation, as Gabe mentioned a minute ago, and really understand who we are and what we can do together in this region. The idea of the bioregion, the binational watershed system, has been a powerful imaginary for reactivating public consciousness about interdependence and cooperation in this region. Several years ago, we curated a cross-border public action through one of the sewage drains that the US had carved into the wall between the Laureles Canyon and the estuary. We negotiated a permit with Homeland Security to transform the drain into an official port of entry going southbound for 24 hours. They agreed. They were disarmed by our self-representation as just artists, as long as Mexican immigration officials were waiting on the south side of the wall to stamp our passports. Our convoy was comprised of 300 local activists, representatives from both cities, and border activists from around the world. And as we moved together here under the wall, we witnessed slum wastewater and plastics rushing toward the estuary beneath our feet. This strange crossing from estuary to slum through a militarized culvert and the stamping of passports visualized, right, the profound conflicts and interdependencies of our border region. And the great takeaway here was that protecting the vulnerable U.S. estuary demands shared investment in the Mexican settlement. So in this cultural experiment, we went down underneath, but sometimes unwalling the territory demands ascending above. The conflicts that we experience here locally between nation and nature are reproduced again and again along the entire trajectory of the continental border between the United States and Mexico. These aerial photos document precise moments where the jurisdictional line collides with natural systems, powerfully illustrating what dumb 19th century sovereignty looks like when it hits the ground in a complex bioregion. Our Mexus map, then reimagines what this continental border zone looks like without the line. Mexus dissolves the border into a bioregion comprised of a series of binational watersheds that are disrupted by the line. Mexus also exposes other systems and flows across this bioregional territory. Tribal nations, protected lands, cropland, urban crossings, many more informal ones, 15 million people and more. Ultimately, Mexus counters America's wall-building fantasies with more expansive imaginaries of belonging and cooperation beyond the nation state. Here it is a few years ago at the Venice Architecture Biennale. Now, stretching to the global scale, and the end of our presentation, is a visualization project we call the Political Equator, which traces an imaginary line from San Diego, Tijuana across the planet, forming a corridor of global conflict between the 30 and 38th parallels north. Along this trajectory lies some of our world's most contested and violent thresholds. Our border, the busiest land crossing in the Western Hemisphere, the Strait of Gibraltar in the Mediterranean, the main routes from North Africa into Fortress Europe, the Israeli-Palestinian border, a cauldron of human suffering and injustice that has exploded once again in the most horrific way. India, Pakistan, a site of enduring territorial conflict since British partition, the border between North and South Korea, decades of intractable Cold War conflict, and you don't see it here, but China's accelerating militarization of the South China Sea. Now, visualizing this political equator in red, with the climatic equator below, represented here in green, was an astonishing discovery for our lab. You had to see the moment. Because the ribbon in between them, give or take a few degrees, contains our planet's most populous slums, its sites of greatest natural resource extraction and export, and its zones of greatest political instability, climate vulnerability, human displacement, and all of Trump's shithole countries. They're all in there. In the end, the collision of nationalism and border building, climate catastrophe, and the dramatic movement of peoples is really the global injustice trifecta of our time. As we anxiously await the next period of political violence to hit our border region, it's coming, it's inevitable. We anticipate that the community stations that we described here today will become even more important on both sides as an alternative coalition of care to increase community capacity, political action, and bottom-up social organization and habitat restoration in the next period. Thank you so much.
Let's talk coyotes. Another thing in the watershed that we share is flora, fauna, insects, birds, all of which we need for, all of that biodiversity is necessary for what's coming. So when we talk about scale, it's often the micro minutia. Like, it's very convenient for megalomaniacs to build walls you can see from Google Earth as signs of prowess. But to actually talk about the yeast and the bacteria and the things that live in soil, this is another thing that Helen and Newton were aware of back in the 70s with their survival pieces. When they brought the idea of soil production into the gallery, it was the physical labor involved over time to produce something that we were not valuing at all. That he was arguing,
Bing, bing, bing. He was arguing, right? Thank you. Newton saying, yeah, go for the soil pieces. Because if Newton were here right now, he would say, Lauren, what are we going to do about the second Trump election, right? And it's not lost on us who were not in favor of an epistemological suicide, like voting for Trump, right? That the progressives didn't have a narrative. There was not an alternative narrative. And that is why artists are brought in, and that's why Helen and Newton are so seminal and so important. Not just because they were great artists, and Newton, trained with Albers, he understood adjacency, he understood borders, he understood field work from the concept of abstract painting. And the whole concept of abstract painting was a reaction. Am I supposed to stop?
No.
Oh, okay. I heard that when he shakes that a yellow pen, I'm supposed to shut up. But the idea of adjacency and color field is the vibration between these two colors, and Newton understood that, and Helen understood how to talk about that in ways that we not only could see, but we could feel the language. We could feel her empathy for what was being lost, right? And it's not lost on me as a Lithuanian Jewish ancestor that they came from the same genetic material. And Newton often used to call me Grandma Faber. Who was Grandma Faber?
Right, she was the
Okay, so, I was like, thinking, okay, this is an interesting family relationship where I'm playing my mentor's grandmother on Zoom calls. But he would be talking to me about that partly because there is a sense that those of us like Helen and Newton that were born and came into consciousness between the First and Second World War, if our people were wiped out through a genocide, and before they were wiped out through a genocide, they weren't allowed to own land, they weren't allowed to be citizens of many countries, right? So a kind of conceptual roots of what are we all a part of and what do we do about this is something that Newton and Helen and their family would call, I think, conversational drift. So I wanted to end my impulsive thing by saying this small group of us sitting along the edge of the continent by the largest ocean are often probably getting conversational drift from the sea. Last night we got to take a late night walk and listen to sea lions and sea elephants making incredible sounds. What a privilege to be making culture in a place where that's a possibility still, right? It's not lost on us, that ocean makes us think, that vast sea makes us think differently. It's not lost on me that Helen and Newton spent their time between San Diego and Santa Cruz in one of the great, great gulfs where the whales swim by, right? In the canyons of the Pacific. That sense and that scope of scale is something we all share in common. So I wanted to share a little Zoom of Newton and I talking about the work that we do at Metabolic Studio and about development. This is us during COVID, during my rogue PhD. He had me apply for a PhD at UC Santa Cruz that only after I applied for was I told didn't exist. So he agreed to take me on as a rogue PhD, and the result of that was more than I can imagine of recorded Zoom recordings, which I get to live through. And this is one that I'm showing in the way that we can now open up amongst this panel and have a little conversational drift. This is one of them. We were talking about incentivizing people to perceive the case study so that these abandoned spaces can potentially become part of this novel urban ecosystem of spreading grounds for floodplain and light.
Well, you see, here's what I conclude from it, and what I've been driving. I've been thinking about. I've seen this as an outcome for at least 5 years. Well, not an outcome I could do, of course, but an outcome from that work that we were doing, and that is that if you're able to unleash a large enough number of novel ecosystems, nature will find a way to connect them. The minute that happens and exchange happens between the novel ecosystems, well, then something will happen that's miraculous and you can't for a moment predict it.
No, and you know, I had a conversation with Dr. Suzanne Simard from the Mother Tree Project. You know her work. She's a scientist that deals with the old growth forest and studies it in British Columbia. And she's of the forest, third generation in her family to live there. She said that what you're talking about, this exchange between small parcels of land along a redirected river, will be a version of the old growth forest in this hybridized new form of ecology, right? Because the mycelial plant tree connection will operate, it won't operate like it would in nature, but it will operate a whole lot more effectively than it does now. So,
I disagree with one thing you said.
what?
Nature is very creative and creates new systems. So for you to say it won't operate within nature is incorrect. Nature will be guiding you. It's a discourse. What you're doing is offering the life web opportunities to express itself in a place that's been repressed. Now, when it re-expresses itself, it's not going to be like it once was. It's going to be something new. And for all I know, the connection will be birds and rats.
And coyotes, remember how we immediately saw a few years ago the coyote move in?
Is he still there?
No, he left when he healed himself. He seemed to have a injury and he came to the floodplain to repair himself. And then when he got better, he went back to ranging.
I see.
But he stayed with us for about 4 months. And he never ate the cats that lived there. For dinner. And it was quite interesting. But there's also, you know, birds that are taking up because they are benefiting from the living system that's coming out of the floodplain. And we collect stormwater from the roofs of the building and we hold it and then we flood the site when we feel that it's been too dry for too long. So instead of irrigating, we're kind of mimicking flood there.
Well, you're mimicking rain.
Mimicking rain.
And rain is becoming heavier and more intermittent. So you're mimicking its new form.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want a final word?
No, I mean, it's just very emotional to hear that. I was really fortunate, and I really miss my weekly conversations with Newton. His voice is irreplaceable, and I'm so thankful to have those tapes, and this is the first time I've ever shared them publicly, so thank you for bearing witness to that, and also just to feel this is part of scale. Part of scale is that our lives are very short in relationship to the work we need to do. And so Newton's ability to have many conversations of what you see here today, I thought we should make sure to have time to have a conversation amongst us because I think he would have really liked that. And Chris and Anne are amazing. And Tatiana, I want to just say, put together these miraculous exhibitions during, during a time that Newton became an ancestor, right? So we were all together the last time. The last time I saw Newton alive was at a convening that Tatiana put together of many of us here, including Ruth, who I haven't seen since then, too, to talk about this show. And Newton was storming around saying he wanted to make new work, not talk about the past, right? And that's the scale of this conversation, is let's make new work together in this conversation now.
It's a mixed yes. No, I won't be there.
Oh, you won't be there?
I will not be there.
Okay.
But I will be there on Saturday.
So, absolutely, the spirit of all the panel discussions very much wanted to pick up on the Harrison's idea of conversational drift, which we are very much part of, so that's a lovely reminder and absolutely lovely to hear Newton's voice again. But we thought we might just start with a question just to get the joint jumping. I guess it wasn't jumping before. So one of the qualities I remember so well from Harrison's work was their amazing ability to identify really, really good questions. And one of their questions they articulated is, what is the urgency of the moment? And what we wanted to do was to perhaps ask, I think many of the presentations have really touched on that, but perhaps for the panelists just to go through once again, for them, how do they see the answer to that question? If I was to think about our journey with the book, which has taken about 5 years, I think the way we would answer that would be to say, the moment, it's not an immediate instant. It could be, in the Harrison's terms, 100 years. In our book, we actually almost identified that as 500 years from the beginning of technoscience, which actually has been so instrumental. Technoscience, industrialization, a way of thinking in science that has actually been devastating for the environment. So perhaps one panelist at a time, if you want to pick up on that question, what for you is the urgency of the moment? And then we'll open up to the...
We'll start with Gay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think the urgency of the moment is really tied to the moment. And I think what it is that, in the same way that Newton and Helen always looked at figure-field relationships, what's the figure, what's the field, we need to reframe that figure-field conversation, pull ourselves back as the field and put nature into the figure space. So that's nature defining and human society is in the background, and we're doing the reverse. And this last election cycle has proven that more and more. So I would say the urgency of the moment is to reframe our relationship in that way.
I just say very quickly, from my perspective as being educator, I think education is an urgency of the moment, as I see it in my students, and also divisiveness that came to many places rather than connectedness is the urgency of the moment. And I think from the presentations that we've heard today, this idea of uniting people so that we can have united actions and connecting conversations between many agencies that have been segregated from each other, whether it is borders, whether ecology, or even different protections agencies that don't communicate each other. The artists not always communicate with scientists. Politicians don't talk to scientists, don't talk to educators or artists. I think urgency is uniting our efforts and expanding education so that we can solve the problems that we're facing.
The urgency of the moment, I think, requires a critique of the notion of progress. I think a deep inhale, a deep slow down, and a deep recognition that we need to reinvent the epistemological connection to what being alive means.
Thank you, Lauren, that's beautiful. I agree with the idea of slowing down. I think a lot of what we're trying to do with the museum is taking us from the scrolling down, scrolling in, consuming images and culture and information, to take a minute to observe, to recognize what's around you. How does that connect you to your environment, to your peers, to the world around you? And I think we need to spend more time with it. And the idea of time, not in relationship to like a destination or a future forging, but time is an opportunity to contemplate, to be with each other, to be present, to take a deep breath.
Very beautiful, just beautiful. And I feel this, what I'm saying is a synthesis of everything we've heard. I see it as a dissolution of public imagination and public trust, losing a sense of what we share, which has been carried and reinforced by people who have an interest in dissolving public trust and the sense of what we share. And education is clearly a part of the solution. A lot of my own work is focused on how we teach climate change at the University of California. We need to rethink what we mean by education and communication. It's not about data and numbers and projections. It's about reshaping experience. And again, cultivating a sense that what we share is under attack.
Yes, I'm still mourning from a couple of weeks, couple of Tuesdays ago. So yes, everything becomes relative, has been relativized, our aspirations, much of the work that we are all trying to advance. What all of that presents to me is that the urgency is that we have to stop preaching to the choir. Mm-hmm. How do we speak to the enemy? How do we speak to those who disagree? And obviously, Fona and myself, in the context of producing this system for reciprocal knowledge, because we're interested in decolonizing knowledge. We're interested in co-producing those new narratives and use that critical awareness with communities in the margins. But what does knowledge transfer means, and how do we operationalize it? What is the role of art in the context of all of this? So yes, the urgency of producing new experiences to raise critical awareness about not only the impacts, the fundamental local impacts of climate change, but what is obvious, what is beautiful about the Harrisons is always about what I would call common sense conceptualization. That the survival of the individual depends on the health of the collective. And why don't we get that?
No, you're fine. I'm looking for anybody who's got a question. If you could, or a contribution, don't feel you have to make a question. Maybe you all are a bit stunned by all of this.
I'd just like to say, going back to the idea of drift, Lauren mentioned the coyote who showed up on the moon site where we've been doing this work for a long time. And the coyote healed and was emblematic of our situation and why we were there, but also was doing its own thing and truly did not eat cats, which was weird. And then healed and got out and went on and did other things. And meanwhile, other creatures were going through other traumatic events. And then just recently, one of its mates or friends or family showed back up and is back on this site and again perusing and doing its thing and being engaged. And you know, you mentioned this thing about like the creativity of the artist, of as artists, going to these power structures and using the thing that they don't understand about us, that they think we're somehow jesters or some not important, but it allows us access because they don't think we're important, and it gets us underneath those bridges, it gets us underneath the walls. Lauren uses that method in the work that we've been doing at the studio now for 20 years, and it's magic. And the coyote did the same thing. We have these bars, and somehow he figures out how to come onto the property. And it's a creative way of engaging with this world. So in Los Angeles, one of the experimental projects is a site that was first imagined to prevent speculated developers from building useless buildings along a river that's misunderstood by the city of Los Angeles, as all rivers are misunderstood by all the power structures out there. And so we have turned it into kind of a place of sanctuary, of safety, of imagination, of using a lot of what Helen and Newton talked about to us and to Lauren and to the world as a kind of a laboratory. And we have brought in material from various locations that wanted to get rid of it. We have made our own material. We do our own investigations into water collection, into soil production, into kind of taking care of each other, and a variety of other things that happen on that site, including inviting these creatures to free reign of what we have, and like Newton said, it might be the rats and the pigeons, and they're there too. And we've been running programs out of this site for years now, and it's at a very interesting junction where it has become a forest. It is an urban forest, and a resource for the community. It's a place where people can come and participate in. They were there for election night, where we all grieved together and immediately had the opportunity to share our grief and what are we going to do. Immediately talk about what are we going to do. And so it's, again, part of the stuff that we have learned over the years. So.
Does anybody else? Yes. Fabulous.
I wanted to say,
It's very awkward, sorry.
I just want
wanted to say how impressive the work of Teddy Cruz and his colleague is, what they're doing along the border. I don't think many people are really aware of it, and it's just absolutely amazing. And I was wondering if the Harrisons ever, were they involved? I mean, they were teaching at UCSD, did they propose, or were they involved with any issues related to the border? And then the other question is, we're facing today this incredible issue of increasing our housing density in San Diego, and the impact that that's going to have on all of our ecosystems. I was hoping that maybe the university is involved in some way with the power structure to have them think about what the impact of these 22-story new buildings that are proposed up near the university, et cetera. Even the growth of the university alone on the area is amazing.
Yes, just to comment, Fauna formal is in political science, I'm in the visual arts, so we sort of bridge to parts of campus that are never in conversation with each other. Towards the end of Newton's life, we were able to connect together because I obviously knew Newton as part of the visual arts department community, and he contaminated me. Peninsula Europe became potentially the most important leverage for us to challenge the stupidity, the imposition of the jurisdictional line of the nation state, truncating the hydroecological systems that should be what organizes our, obviously, social relations, and as we commented briefly, our conceptions of citizenship in a divided territory. And so yes, the conversations were constantly synergistic about that. Our visualizations, the whole Mexus project really is a little child of Peninsula Europe. This beautiful project, if you don't know it, of presenting Europe as a peninsula, but also to say and talk about communication, talk about education, talk about how do we produce new cognitive, visual, and exploration systems. What we know of geopolitical sort of a configuration of the world is just based on borders, the shape of Italy, the shape of Spain, What if we eliminated those borders? What do we visualize? What do we prioritize? And in the case of Peninsula Europe, as the highlands, the watersheds, and produces a different figure. So Newton, great idea. We're going to do it. We have to do it here. We have to prioritize what we don't see. And how do we allow, in this case, I don't want to say artistic visualizations, but visualization itself as a political tool to raise awareness of what we don't see. And so the conversation was very fertile between us, I think, and that's, it's fantastic. So he didn't know about the community stations that much.
No.
Because this is very recent in our work, this is what brought together everything that we've been doing in the last decades. I had a last conversation with him. I invited him usually to come to my class and through Zoom, and I still have it. I'm sorry I shoot that. It was just wonderful, and he was aware, but I wish we could have taken him and Helen in person. I don't know if you
I just would like to add to what Teddy just said. So the first time Helen and Newton talking about dictatorship of ecology as a kind of concept of city-state in 1976. That's a work, the meditation on the Great Lakes, which is divided between the United States and Canada, and United States industrial production sites pollute all the water, which is considered to be potable, but essentially they discovered during their time in 1976 that chemical pollution flows across the entire. And so they had their extreme proposal that all of the nations living around and people have to withdraw from the state of United States and also Canada to create their own state that would be united by the watersheds of the Great Lakes. And similarly, their other work of 1991, which is the Tibet is a high ground, which is a hot spot, another hot spot, because the glaciers are melting and all these 5 rivers that are feeding China and India and of course Pakistan, where there is a conflict. they will deteriorate and all these people will be without water. But they are fighting to the death on the border. They are not solving the problem of ecology. So those people, those nations have to withdraw from those states to form their own state that would take care of watershed and the survival of those people.
And just to weigh in on conversational drift, the means by which they would often communicate these were what they would call prophetic maps. Prophetic maps. And those maps were conceptual works that begged us as an audience to see the world differently. And so I thought what Teddy and Fauna showed was very much influenced with prophetic mapping, because it really helped me see the logic of place and the illogic of trying to divide that which has been formed by geological time, which is the intertwined inheritance of abundance that we don't have any rational reason to be not accepting the abundance of the web of life, which Newton would always say will always overproduce. So we're counter-logical when we defend against nature's overproduction in a watershed.
Wonderful. On this idea of prophetic mapping, this is going to get a little bit wonky, but people study how beliefs and attitudes and behaviors in people change and what kinds of agents can produce that change. And prophetic mapping and understanding where things might be, say, 10 years from now or 20 or 40 years from now, seems to have an impact on people regarding the impacts of climate change, wherever they happen to fall on the political spectrum. Understanding their own neighborhoods, right? And the futures of their children, that seems to matter. Sadly, they have to go through huge fires and floods before it begins to dawn on them that their own reality is threatened. But the maps, people are using these sort of prophetic maps now in sort of planning exercises, even in South Florida on sea level rise.
Yeah.
And it's beginning slowly to dawn on people that it matters.
Sorry, thank you. Which one of you?
I'll go first, and I'll pass on the microphone too. So we've heard a fair amount of commentary critiquing power structures and the government, and probably the incoming government too. And that makes me think about Newton's comment in an interview he had recently before he passed away, but a recent interview before he passed away, which he talked about how many of his works, and his and Helen's works, he would consider failures. That they didn't achieve what they set out to do, or they never got from the conceptual element to actually being brought about. But some of those works were brought about, and I'd like to get maybe some of the panel's opinions or feedback on some of the successes. Up in Pasadena, for example, in Santa Monica, particularly outside of Pasadena, so the 3 or 4 works in Southern California, therefore California works, that did achieve their existence as a work of art, and B, a kind of environmental statement, particularly what was called Devil's Canyon. It's got another name now, the Gabrielinos renamed it, but the big outside of Pasadena park, and some other projects too. If anyone has any opinions on those, I'd love to hear that.
Okay. Well, there are a couple of things to say about that, because really what you're touching on is 2 things. One is this really important concept that we started this with, which is called conversational drift. And that is that you start to work on something, you create this body of work, you invite people in to talk about it, and they get engaged. And that's also an antidote to what Teddy's talking about, is that you bring people in so you hear their ideas. You don't have to accept them wholesale, but you take them in. There's a concept that you brought up about density, and we could pull that apart in a group setting and sort of say, what is it that really means? Does it mean what we're saying, or could we weave those comments into a new reality? And so what Helen and Newton were expert at is creating an initial conversation, and what they called failures was really tongue-in-cheek, because they were launching an idea and then it would go out. And so, for example, in the case of one of the projects, the first project I showed you, Holland, what happened is we did this great piece It was spectacular. We thought, okay, the government got involved, even people, we would have an open studio, people would come into the studio, they would get excited, they would look at it. We'd have farmers coming in and moving the line of this great ring a little bit here, a little bit there. We got a lot of attention. And then the government changed. And then suddenly people were no longer interested. It was like, what happened? 5 years later, they get a call and they found out that that was actually still really influential among the landscape architects and the bureaucratic class that had seen it. And now that a new government was coming in, they wanted to enact parts of it. And they even won an award for that because the government of Holland enacted a large part of that. And that's part of the conversational drift. And Newton and Helen will be the first to say, you don't know what the outcome will be, and you really don't care. You actually just have to make the argument, make the conversation, bring as many voices into that conversation as you can, and still formulate your new idea, your new icon. And they were masters of creating a visual icon that restructured the way people thought about something in the same way you're looking at mapping, and that's the way they did. So it's really important to think about. And there are many of those successes that drifted away and came back. I think that's a model for everyone, not to lose hope or heart, but to understand that the process is really important, and that what looks like a minor victory now may be, or a minor loss now may become a major victory, as long as you're true to those ideals and you keep working.
Well, that's the strength of being an artist. You know, you can make these proposals, and if they don't hold water, it doesn't kind of matter, because you're still making art, and we all then look at ourselves and go, oh, well, it's still an artwork. You know, and then later these things become relevant. Later they get picked up, and I think it's sort of a wonderful guise to wear. We need more artists. You know, we need more people engaging in the world on this level. That then there aren't failures. They're just wonderful artworks that maybe turn into some other kind of success. And we've had a lot of success with local governments that pick up on things years later, and you're always like, well, what took you so long? But you do this incremental change. You know?
I just want to also pick up on the word failure. I think when Newton would say failure, he would really mean that something was pissing him off, right? So I wouldn't take his comment as a lot of his projects failed too literally. I would take it as he was working on figuring out how to channel how pissed off he was at the blockages he was facing towards the realization of something that was fundamentally obvious, right, to him and people he would work with. And I think that the way he would mitigate that was conversational drift that took its form in terms of letter writing. Because he would write some epic novel letters to the people he thought were preventing his good ideas from being realized. And some of those letters are pretty potent directives for how the world should be. Would you agree? I'm thinking about Fires of the West, for example, where he has a much better way of explaining how to mitigate fires of the West. He sent it to Governor Brown at an invitation, and he did not succeed to get what he wanted, which was lots of money to fix the system, right? And so he might consider that a failure, but that's not what he actually meant. It was an impasse that was fueling him. Would you, David?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's what, if you look at their entire career, they spent 50 years working on a single set of problems, which was, how do we realign our relationship with nature and the environment? And they did it starting in early 70s and continued for 50 years in the same problem. And so they would say anything but that it was a failure. And they would say it was the opposite, that every time they hit that impasse, that drove them to reconsider, to rethink, to rephrase. And if you look at the arc of their career, there are so many ideas that they struggled with in one project, and then the next one, it reappears, and they rethink it and they reframe it. And then 5 years later, that same idea reappears as they reframe it again based on new information, new insights, and new realities. So it really is, a sense of the sweep of your intentions in the world. And that has to be long-term and, to your point, persistent.
Chris, it's over there. No.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Diego and then this gentleman. I don't know if it'll work or not.
Thank you. Oh, wow.
It's best if you away from
Away from it? Okay, cool. Gabriel, first of all, I wanted to thank you for your definition of ecological art as like an interpretation and then an articulation of patterns in human behavior and landscape. I think it really helped me contextualize a lot of what I've been consuming today, like among all the panelists. And I started trying to identify patterns in everyone and their work. And what I've come to understand was there was a lot of everyone's like practice, like unwalling, undevelopment, like calls for the erosion of these systems of exploitation and extraction and displacement. And in the spirit of like conversational drift, you mentioned like an enemy, like speaking to an enemy. And I wanted to get the sense of like, who is the enemy that you're trying to speak to, and how do you do that when a lot of the practice calls for dismantling these systems that the enemy created?
Good question. That's a fantastic question. By the way, I corrected myself about enemy.
Yeah.
Because I just thought of Chantal Mouffe scolding me. Is the adversary. I mean, we need to engage institutions. We need to infiltrate into governance. Artists must be interlocutors of institutional memory. What is the language? Artists have also perpetuated, we have unfortunately perpetuated the aestheticization of everything. Art as a commodified thing, the self-referential role of aesthetics in our life. The Harrisons presented one of the last conversations with Newton was that he was tired of artists dealing with environment and campus, in my campus, like with the scripts, all of a sudden scripts interested in artists, but it's not about decorating data. I mean, artists must lead the way in terms of conceptual frameworks, and so words matter. Art is less a metaphor and more an operative system. This is what ecology is, embedded in relational, dynamics and so on. And so yes, displacing much of that language is what I meant by what is it that we then communicate with others. When it comes to the adversary, well, I should say, I mean, we have been fighting against neoliberal politics and economics, privatization. That's our enemy. But I'm talking about our own. But in the questions of stupid growth, which is really at the center of the crisis.
Which is a campus question.
And finally, I should say, well, anyway, yes, that there is much to open that up in that direction. And
let's go to this agenda.
Okay, great.
I don't know if this is going to help or whether.
That's fine.
Thank you.
I just want to say how nice it was to hear the different voices from all the presenters and the themes in which they presented their work. I was very impressed by that. I'm an academic. I've been an academic for half a century. And I've been dealing with various subjects, and I wanted to see kind of a convergence in my own thinking about what all of you were saying. And one of the things I want to point out is that the term ecology or ecosystem is derivative from the Greek context for home. It's household. It's oikos in the classical, and the modern it's ecos. So it becomes the space in which we live in. So how we treat that space is fundamental to our own existence. And one of the things about nature is nature will do its thing. And human beings are not aware of the thing they're doing, to put it in that respect, in their effect on nature. The other thing I wanted to make a point about is that borders are not fixed. They're permeable. We as human beings are permeable. Nature is permeable too, to our reactions and the reactions they all create in the process of that permeability. So we are totally permeable. We are here in this place, in this space, by a unique set of circumstances that brought us here by one means or another. That we cannot easily differentiate, or maybe we can. But that's the other part about it. The permeability of our own existence is a factor we have to take into consideration. And part of it is in their educational system, is there's little focus on ecology as a formal system of coexistence with nature, which is built into our existence. We are nature human beings. And in that process, we are missing that ecological consciousness. As a young child, I spent a number early years in Europe and early years in the later part of the United States. And I was thinking about one of the things that the courses and the program that I was in is we had child gardening. So I went to school, elementary school, and we had each child had a portion of the garden, and they took care of the soil, they decided the plants, they took care of the plants. And when I came back as a child back in the United States again, and I took art classes, we drew the plants. I was thinking, we drew the leaves, we collected the leaves, we categorized the leaves, we made a kind of an art project out of that process. So what I want to sort of emphasize is that the significance of eco and the ecosystem is that we are part of it, but we need to think about it in a symbiotic relationship as much as we can, because human beings are non-symbiotic with nature as we understand our historical existence. We have skewed it in a variety of ways. But each social stage of our consciousness and each social stage of our existence is altered nature, and we are continuing to alter it today. So technologies are always going to be a factor of our existence, but the permutation of that is how do we deal with it? How do we compose it? How do we create it? And we live in a more of a symbiotic, conscious existence of our creation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was really I think we've got time for one. No, that's good.
Just sort of echoing what you said, and then maybe thinking about how Lauren first started us.
Take that away.
Or a kind. And we forget that we have a lot of wisdom on our indigenous peoples who knew how to live with nature. And we need to go back to those teachings and to that type of relationship, because we have westernized our thinking in ways in which is destroying us. If we think about what our relationship with our ancestors, with the knowledge that we're passing to each other, and how a drifting conversation can build upon that, would be a new perspective. We just need to really go back to those teachings, go back to what is happening when we think about what the Kumeyaay that are well alive are still doing in our region and how they're contributing. I think of the extinction of the Lenape in New York and how they were displaced, but we're in relationship with other communities, and how much teaching there is that we need to recover, and ways of teaching and learning, and most of it is in conversation and dialogue. So I don't want us to forget that there is a lot of knowledge that has been there and exists today.
That's beautiful. And that actually, I also wanted to respond to the question of enemies and borders and these clear demarcations between people and territory and so on, and really draw out what you described as the porosity and movement across these, what are ultimately porous spaces. One of the things that we do in our research is to try to document the flows and circulations that actually define the border region and frame the sort of hybrid identities of the people who inhabit it: air, water, waste, culture, health, money, hope, love, justice. All these things are moving. Border zones are not places where things stop. And I think it's the same when it comes to us and them, who's in, who's out, who's with us, who's an enemy, and so on. I think there are interests that are deeply trying to reinforce the fact that we are separated, and that there is the coastal elite, the artist, the aestheticized artist, and the rest of the country who looks at us like clowns. And to reinforce that, we need to break those down. The idea of edge conditions. We need more edge conditions where things blur, and to really amplify the porosity in those spaces, because there is room for movement, even though everything seems like it's bounded and rigid.
And later, I just want to have one more about the other side, but yes.
Ruth, go on.
Well, this is just something that's coming to me. I don't know how much sense it makes, but I was thinking about the comments about growth. I was thinking about the comments about prophetic maps and the maps that you showed And I was thinking of a project that I actually did where the Harrisons lived in Carmel Valley. And I interviewed lots of people, and I overlaid the Thomas Brothers maps, and you could see how the planners in the 70s had prophetic plans that actually won all kinds of awards for, concentrating neighborhoods, having neighborhood schools, having public transportation, et cetera, and then they talked about how it was death by 1,000 cuts. And I thought, what if they had had a prophetic map? Because there really was no image of what they were proposing, as far as I know, that could have maybe galvanized the community in the way that Greenheart of Holland did. And so I'm wondering even now, the Harrisons, both Helen and Newton told me at some point, we just give up on working in San Diego. And I'm sure that was at moments of frustration. I know they've been in dialogue with you. But I'm wondering what would be a prophetic, even now, it seems like the charge for all of us is a prophetic regional map.
Yes.
That it's really San Diego and Tijuana. I'm sure you're working on it, but it feels, it's just
scary.
What I hope comes out of this conversation is prophetic naps and how growth can happen, that it's at nodes, it's not, and we could that in honors indigenous knowledge and indigenous movement, because the indigenous communities moved, they weren't just, so anyway, it's just what I'm hearing is coming out.
And instead Carmel Valley got El Paseo.
That's, if I can, may I just comment on that, because that helps me a little bit about what I wanted to say, a little bit of an extra comment about the adversary, because that influences in a way what is the language, what are the prophetic maps that can operationalize a different, more complicated conversation beyond this polarization and so on. And I'm thinking also that those prophetic maps have been circulating. Obviously, the Harrisons, which is what our interest is in fact in doing that. But already in the 70s, Kevin Lynch, as you know, with Appleyard produced Temporary Paradise. That for us, at least locally, was the most prophetic map of all. At a time when San Diego was beginning to grow irresponsibly through this horrendous sprawl, Kevin Lynch says, hey guys, if you continue to do this, you're going to lose your paradise. So he called it, temporary paradise with a question mark, and the prophetic map there was that it was the canyons, just like Harrison's, the Harrisons would advance, what becomes the framework, right? Particularly in San Diego, more than Los Angeles, the network of canyons that go beyond the jurisdictional line, what should organize the future of this region, not only for San Diego, but they were the first ones to say the future of San Diego depends on the future of Tijuana. The destinies of these cities is intertwined, and the canyons is the framework for that relationship. But what I was going to say is that at that point you would imagine that the prophetic map, which gets to the adversary issue, is that we've become our own adversaries. Perpetuating the idea again that we are, not even idea, the clear fact that we are voting against our own interests. Yes, I can go to a meeting with politicians and I talk about collective, public, all of these issues that interest us, all of us. The social safety net being eroded, It is not until we refocus the conversation to talk about self-interest, in fact. Self-interest. And that was a revelation in our work to protect our estuary, which is essential for our own security, our own environmental future. We need to invest over there. We need to do, it's like the same thing in Gaza, right? It's like the marginalization of that place for years. Nobody's talking about how the aquifers beneath Gaza end up in Tel Aviv. Interdependence needs to be, and empathy in this case, but interdependence is the most essential political tool. What is the language? What is the communication? What is the prophetic map is the question. But self-interest. To protect us, we need to do this, and to protect our children. So how do we advance a different communication, right?
I just wanted to jump in on the prophetic map thing. Thank you, Teddy, and thank you for this great conversation. I wanted to talk about prophetic map of the last election, when that sea of red was blasted on all of the medias, and the blue, which is the color opposite, red came up, and how tiny that made those of us who are part of blue feel in relationship to the field of red. And say that that is something, what I meant when that we need to get small and we need to get quiet, right? To decolonize that, right? Because of course, not every single person who voted red can simply be written off as an extremist, right? So the question about like what is the adversary, right? I think also has to do with the interpretation of where we think we are and what we assign and align ourselves to. And one of the things that Newton would often like to talk about is flipping the metaphors, right? And one of the things to think about is what does the language "make America great again" mean to so many people, right? What is great about what America was, right? So there's a fundamental binary here. For people who are looking towards reparation, we might be talking about uplifting the voices of indigenous people, but what that would infer is that we have to process our way through that what made America great was actually founded on some pretty not great things, like slavery and the subjugation of indigenous people to a new ideology. So how do we deal with what really great would be is flipping the metaphor on greatness and making that attractive. And because the word great works for people, you want to be a part of something great. So I think part of our work is to think about the way of making a vision of great at the scale of the problems that we're collectively facing, and employing what we've learned from indigenous wisdom, which is it has to last beyond political time. We need a 7-generation vision of greatness so that we put into effect a new notion of greatness that is great over 140 years instead of 8 or 10 or 12.
Yes. Thank you. So, the bells are telling us. The bells are great, that's really clear, no one can be mistaken about, that's the time. But also that kind of brought us right back round to the urgency of the moment, and the moment being a 7th-generation moment rather than short-term, quick profit, and so on. I think I'm just going to suggest some things that I picked up from this that might be kind of thoughts to take away, and then I'm sure Anne will amplify for a moment. But I kind of there was some really interesting things came out. Things like the idea that the question that stops the conversation, that creates a pause, the question that creates a pause and asks you to think again, and that in the specific case that Gabe was talking about, it was the fact that the Harrisons, people look at the work and they don't see art, because actually in a way the Harrisons weren't trying to aestheticize something, they were trying to evoke the pattern. And I think that's such a useful way to kind of, when you go and look at any of the exhibitions, to take that thought with you. I thought Teddy saying that they made space for you, but I think that by implication, they made space for so many people, for botanists, for ecologists, for farmers, they made space for people to be part of works and conversations, and that was actually uniquely, they made space for people to be involved in so many ways, and they made space actually in an intergenerational way, because they constructed the Center for the Study for the Force Majeure as an ongoing entity for the work. So it wasn't just them making space around them, they were making space into the future, and they were making space that this work can be picked up and carried on, the way of thinking. And I think then the other thing that was great was about failure, and how we have to be willing to talk about and live with failure in exactly, Gabe talking about works weren't failures because actually sometimes it just took time for people to realize that they were right. That Rich talking about artworks are artworks. Actually, artists are the most ruthless judges of their own work. I mean, Anne's been throwing away slides of works that she made 30 years ago. No, artists are the most ruthless judges of their own work, actually. But actually what matters is the judgment over time and being willing to see that something might be more important later and recognized later. And I think those were and then there was the thing about what do we prioritize if we remove borders? What happens if you take the border away? What does the world look like? And I think so those were the sort of takeaways I had from the conversation. And we need to do some thank yous. So we need to thank the panel for a fabulous. The Historical Society. We have to thank the curatorial team, the project director, and the curator. We have to thank the Getty, because actually the way we and I need to thank Metabolic Studio because I've been able to be here being really part of an amazing community and conversation thanks to the Metabolic Studio and Laura and all of that. So that's my thank you.
I would actually like to thank Anne Craig, who has hosted us so beautifully.
Yes.
Maybe he came to the Wheel Center. Yeah, he came to the Wheel Center, but he wasn't.
Yeah, here's the curator. She can actually answer your question.
Wondering the date and the photo. The date of the photo is when they were doing the project, which is 1991, whatever it is.
Okay, because the drawing is 91, it says. So the photos 90s?
Yeah, the same time.
Done at the same time?
Yeah, that's when they were doing the drawing.
I was wondering what it looks like today if we did another aerial.
Yeah, well,
That was so cool.
we don't have a current one. I thought I would commission someone to do the aerial photo, but we don't have it.
Yeah.
It's gorgeous how it's cut out
Yes.
with the contour.
Yes.
Wow. So did they draw together?
Actually, sometimes they actually commission some other people to work on the action. So Newton did like those SNL pieces, those films. I mean, it just depends on situation. They did some photographs. Sometimes they commission under the supervision the photographs made and some drawings made in the studio. And Gabriel drew and his wife drew some of those drawings recently, and it was designed with
Not following you, just watching that.